In the ruins of Delphi, archaeologists uncovered a fissure that once exhaled sweet-smelling gas. The ancients called it the breath of a god, but beneath that temple lay an older secret, a buried goddess, and the women forced to speak her fading voice. This is not myth. It is the documented story of ritual control, possession, and the slow erasure of female divinity. What you are about to hear is the final echo of the earth itself, the oracle who drowned in smoke. Before marble and gold, before the name of Apollo was sung, Delphi was a wound in the mountain. The people called it Gaia's mouth, a vent of invisible vapor rising from the rock. Those who stood too near felt dizziness, trembling, a sweet numbness of the tongue. In that trembling, the first voices were born, women who listened to the breathing earth and repeated what it told them. They lived apart in a hollow shrine of clay and blackened stone. The villagers brought grain, oil, and young animals to trade for prophecy. The women accepted these offerings with solemn restraint, then descended into the fissure. What they inhaled made them shake and moan as if the earth itself moved through them. The men who waited above believed they were hearing the goddess speak. None asked how much pain the trance required. In time, the priests of a new god arrived from the islands, followers of Apollo, the conqueror of the serpent. They came with marble blocks, silver vessels, and a promise of order. They spoke gently of light, of reason, of a god who would silence the chaos below. Yet they looked at the women of Gaia as remnants of a darker age, bodies that could still channel what their words could not. The first stones of the new temple were laid directly over the cavern's mouth. The old priestesses were forbidden to use their names. They were told the goddess they had served was dead, her serpent guardian slain by Apollo's radiant arrow. Now they were to serve as vessels for the sun. Their chants were rewritten, their gestures redefined. Each breath of vapor was no longer Gaia's whisper, but Apollo's command. The women obeyed, their trance now a weapon of persuasion, their exhaustion recast as divine grace. Ancient records carved in stone speak of this transformation as purification. The truth was simpler: control. To shape a voice that once belonged to the earth into a mouthpiece for empire required more than faith. It required breaking. The new rites were long and exhausting. The women were stripped, washed, anointed with oil, and wrapped in pale linen until their movement was small as breathing itself. When they descended into the smoke, they were not alone. Attendants guided every motion, measuring obedience as holiness. Those who resisted grew ill. The gases seared the lungs, the heat blistered skin, and yet refusal was blasphemy. The priests called the suffering sacred, the convulsions proof that Apollo had entered the body. Outside, crowds listened for the oracle's words, unaware that each prophecy cost the speaker another part of herself. By the generation's end, the language of Gaia had vanished. Only the title remained: Pythia, the mouthpiece. Beneath the gleaming floors, the fissure still sighed through cracks in the stone, the buried goddess exhaling her last. The priests called it a miracle. The women knew it was morning. Thus Delphi was reborn, not as the sanctuary of the earth, but as the throne of a god who conquered her voice. And in that silence began the making of Melantha, the girl who would one day breathe the same smoke and never return. When the second moon of spring rose over Kura, the messengers of Delphi came down the mountain. They carried no weapons, only olive branches bound with white wool, the sign that a god had spoken. In every village they sought a child whose birth had been marked by unusual stillness, a calm that priests claimed the divine could inhabit. Among the huts of stone and straw they found Melantha, a peasant girl of 14 who worked the fields barefoot and silent. Her mother protested, but resistance was useless. To refuse a summons from Delphi was to invite famine or plague. The girl was taken at dawn, bathed in the river Castalia, and clothed in linen so thin it revealed the tremor of her ribs. To the villagers, it looked like an honor. To those who had watched other daughters disappear, it looked like mourning. At the sanctuary, Melantha was met by elder attendants, women whose eyes were hollow from long service. They cut her hair, rubbed her skin with ash, and told her she now belonged to the light. A hymn was sung to seal the vow. The sound was soft, but each word closed a door behind her. The priests began their education with silence. For 3 days she was not permitted to speak. Bread and water were rationed. Sleep came only when exhaustion forced it. The isolation was called purification, a cleansing of mortal thought so the divine could enter. On the 4th day, she was led to the upper court where the marble temple rose over the smoking earth. There she met the prophetai, the men who interpreted the trances of women. They explained that a true oracle must surrender every private desire. The body was a vessel, the voice a tool, the will a disease to be cured. Historical fragments tell of such initiations. They were acts of discipline masked as devotion. Fasting to weaken the flesh, rhythmic breathing to dull awareness, chants that bound the mind to repetition. Melantha's youth made her pliant. Her obedience pleased them. She was instructed to kneel when spoken to keep her eyes lowered when men of the sanctuary passed. Each gesture of submission was recorded as evidence of holiness. On the 7th day, she was brought to the threshold of the adyton, the narrow stair descending toward the fissure. Heat rose through the cracks, carrying the sweet scent of laurel and sulfur. An attendant brushed oil across her temples and whispered that she must breathe deeply when the time came. "The god enters through the breath," the woman said, "and leaves through the mouth." Melantha nodded, though she did not understand. From that moment, her life was measured by ritual. At sunrise, she swept the marble floors until her hands bled. At dusk, she recited hymns beside the vapor well, her voice echoing in the hollow stone. The priests praised her clarity. They said Apollo had chosen well. Yet when night fell and the torches dimmed, she felt the mountain pulse beneath her, a slow, living heartbeat, older than the god above. In sleep, she dreamed of roots coiling around her ankles, pulling her downward into warm darkness. The breath of the earth filled her lungs, heavy and sweet. She awoke gasping, unable to tell whether the sound in her chest was her own or the whisper of something buried. Thus the girl of dust became the vessel of smoke. Her body was now property of the sanctuary, her silence its foundation. Above her, the marble glittered in the morning sun. Below, the ancient fissure waited, patient, breathing, remembering. The sanctuary of Delphi glittered like a wound under the marble sun. Each morning the priests opened the bronze gates and let the light fall upon the altars where the sacrifices bled. The smell of smoke and burning flesh was constant, a perfume of devotion and decay. To the pilgrims who climbed the sacred slope, it was the fragrance of the divine. To those who lived inside its walls, it was the stench of obedience. Melantha now served among them, one pale figure in a sea of white robes. She carried bowls of water, washed the marble floors, and learned the hymns that begged for mercy from a God who offered none. When the sun rose high, the heat on the stone made the air shimmer, and she could feel the mountain breathing through the cracks beneath her feet. The elders called this the voice of Apollo, but to Melantha, it sounded more like the earth weeping. In the courtyard stood the great tripod, where sacrifices were burned. Animals were led to slaughter, their throats opened with bronze knives, their blood poured into golden basins. The priest said the god tasted truth through blood, that purity came through offering. Sometimes when the pilgrims were desperate enough, they offered something more precious than livestock. Records from later centuries whisper of such rites, offerings of chastity, flesh, and servitude given to secure divine favor. In Delphi, these acts were never written down, only remembered in the trembling of those who survived them. The chosen women, the Pythia, were purified not only through prayer and smoke, but through ritual surrender. It was said that before Apollo's spirit could enter a body, The mortal part of it had to be broken. The priests called it sanctification. To Melantha, it was an unmaking. Her days blurred into heat and hymns, her nights into whispered oaths and trembling silence. She learned that the god's power was never questioned, only endured. Each act of devotion carved a piece away from her until she could no longer recall the voice she once had. One afternoon, she was brought into the adyton, the inner sanctum, to sweep the stone floor. The chamber was narrow, lit by a single shaft of light that fell through the roof. The air inside was dense and heavy with incense. At its center, a fissure exhaled thin tendrils of vapor. It was here, the elders said, that the god spoke. Melantha knelt, her fingers tracing the warm stone, and for a moment she felt something pulse beneath it, as if a heart beat within the mountain. When the priests entered, they did not speak. They watched her, studying how she breathed, how her skin glistened with sweat in the rising heat. One of them placed a laurel branch upon her shoulder, a sign that the time of prophecy drew near. Another whispered a hymn about purity, his breath close enough for her to feel the rhythm of his words on her neck. Every gesture, every command was framed as service to the god. But beneath the marble reverence, power and possession blurred into one. By sunset, Melantha had begun to understand what her new life truly meant. The god's voice was not only spoken through her, it was taken from her. The sanctuary demanded not worship, but surrender. And beneath the marble sun, she learned that holiness could be a form of hunger. The morning of Melantha's first descent arrived with a strange stillness. The temple bells did not ring. Only the low hum of the mountain could be heard. The priests the god had awakened early, restless beneath the stone. Melantha was led through the marble halls, her feet bare against the cold floor, her pulse trembling beneath her skin. Today, she would enter the adyton, the chamber no uninitiated soul was meant to see. She descended by torchlight, each step echoing against the rock. The air grew warmer, heavier, until she felt as if the earth itself were breathing. When the final gate closed behind her, she stood before the fissure, a black wound in the ground from which white vapors rose, curling like living smoke. The attendants knelt beside her, murmuring prayers. Laurel leaves burned in bronze bowls. The scent was sharp and sweet, masking the bitterness of sulfur. The priests explained that what rose from the fissure was the god's essence, Apollo's breath. But scholars centuries later would suspect otherwise. Beneath Delphi, they found traces of ethylene and methane, gases capable of blurring the boundary between waking and dream. What Melantha inhaled that day was not divine air, but the poison of the earth, the exhalation of something older, deeper, forgotten. She knelt before the pit, her body trembling. The head priest placed a wreath upon her hair and commanded her to breathe deeply, to open herself so the god might speak through her. When she obeyed, the fumes filled her lungs like fire. The world tilted. The marble floor seemed to ripple beneath her hands. She felt something move, not in her body, but within the air around her, a presence ancient and patient, watching through her eyes. Her mind drifted into darkness. Images surged like dreams. A coiled serpent, vast as the mountain itself, writhing in agony as golden light pierced its skull. The voice that entered her was not Apollo's, it was the echo of the one he had slain. The spirit of Python, guardian of Gaia, still lingered in the cracks beneath Delphi, whispering through the poisonous breath that the priests called holy. Melantha began to convulse. Her voice erupted in sounds no language could name, words that made the torches flicker and the priests fall silent. To them, this was the god's voice, the oracle's gift. They recorded every utterance, trembling in awe of her agony. But Melantha herself felt none of their reverence. What she felt was invasion, something crawling through her veins, cold and infinite. When the vision ended, she collapsed, her body slick with sweat, her eyes wide and empty. The priests rushed to her, lifting her head, forcing water between her lips. They praised the god for choosing her, for allowing her to survive the first communion. But deep within her chest, beneath the pain and exhaustion, a whisper remained, low, serpentine, defiant. From that day forward, each trance left her weaker, yet more attuned to the thing that lived in the fumes. She began to hear it even in waking hours, a voice neither male nor divine, murmuring of vengeance and rebirth. What Delphi celebrated as prophecy was, perhaps, possession. And beneath the marble brilliance of the temple, the serpent waited, breathing with her, through her, reclaiming what time and gods had stolen. The temple called it the renewal of the voice. To the priests, it was the moment when Apollo's essence descended once more into his chosen oracle, restoring her gift of prophecy. To Melantha, it was a ceremony she learned to fear long before she understood its purpose. Each season, after the solstice rites, she was summoned to the inner chamber, where the god's breath was said to mingle with mortal flesh. The adyton was prepared with ritual precision. Laurel burned in bronze bowls, covering the air with a sweet haze. Music filled the corridor, slow, mournful, heavy with the beat of drums. Melantha was stripped of her linen veil, her body anointed with oil and ash. The attendants murmured prayers, never meeting her eyes. They called her the vessel, a title that both sanctified and erased her. Historical fragments speak of these ceremonies obliquely, of how the god's union with the oracle was reenacted through the touch of those who served him. It was framed as divine contact, yet it bore all the marks of submission, masked as holiness. In Delphi, sanctity was the language of control. Every gesture, every breath, was justified as service to Apollo's will. As the hymn reached its peak, the head priest approached the trembling girl. His voice was calm, ceremonial, almost tender. He spoke of purity, of devotion, of the need to open herself so the god could speak clearly through her once more. The attendants turned away, eyes lowered, as incense thickened and the torches dimmed. The act that followed was not described in any sacred text, only hinted at through euphemisms of ecstasy and illumination. Melantha felt the marble beneath her grow cold, the air heavy and unmoving. The god, they said, would now touch her. The boundary between sanctity and cruelty dissolved. Her body became both altar and offering, her silence a condition of faith. When the ritual ended, the priests declared that the god had renewed her, that the vessel was pure again. But Melantha's purity was a wound, and her silence became its scar. Outside, the sanctuary bells rang to announce the completion of the rite. Pilgrims cheered, believing the oracle's voice had been restored. None knew what was taken from her to preserve their illusion of divine perfection. In the eyes of Delphi, she was no longer a girl. She was an instrument, an empty space into which others spoke. In later centuries, poets and philosophers would romanticize the oracle's trance, her mysterious connection with the divine, her ecstatic revelations. They wrote of inspiration, never of coercion, of prophecy, never of pain. But beneath those hymns of reverence lay the truth of all the Pythia who came before and after. Their sanctity was enforced, their bodies shaped to fit the god's design. When Melantha emerged from the chamber that night, the stars above the sanctuary seemed sharper, colder. The mountain wind carried the faint scent of sulfur from the fissure, mingled with the fading sweetness of laurel. She looked up toward the silent sky, unsure whether the voice she now carried belonged to a god or to the memory of what had been taken from her. Delphi would praise her as blessed. History would call her holy. Yet beneath the marble and myth, her sanctity was built upon the quietest of crimes, one committed not in darkness, but in blinding light. Each year, when the Pythian Games returned to Delphi, the sanctuary transformed from a place of silence into one of spectacle. Thousands ascended the sacred slope, kings, soldiers, poets, and supplicants, all seeking the oracle's blessing. The marble courtyards filled with banners in bronze, the air thick with incense and wine. It was called the Feast of the Gods' Triumph, a celebration of Apollo's victory over the serpent Python. Yet beneath the music and offerings, another story writhed, one older, darker, and more human. Melantha was placed at the center of the pageant. Draped in gold-threaded linen, her body shimmered like sunlight on oil. The priest said she represented purity, the mortal form through which the gods' victory was made eternal. To the crowds, she was divine beauty embodied. To herself, she was a relic, hollowed by ritual, compelled to smile for the faith of others. The ceremonies began with sacrifice. White bulls were led to the altars, their throats cut so their blood could anoint the stone. The spectators cheered as the crimson flowed down the steps, a river of faith feeding the mountain's thirst. The smell of death and incense mingled into something almost sweet. Melantha watched from her marble seat, the sacred laurel wreath trembling in her hands. When the sun reached its height, the hymns changed. The priest sang not of purity but of domination, of how Apollo had conquered the serpent, silencing the chaos beneath the earth. Yet in that triumph lay irony. The serpent's breath still lingered, seeping through the fissure that sustained the oracle's voice. The god's victory depended on the very monster he had slain. Melantha, seated above the crowd, could feel the mountain shudder beneath the music. A slow vibration moved through her bones. It was faint at first, then rhythmic, as though something beneath the earth responded to the drums above. She remembered the voice she had heard in the fumes, the whisper that was not Apollo's. In that moment, as the people shouted praises, she felt the serpent stir once more. The priests commanded her to rise. She stepped forward onto the dais, her bare feet pressing against the warm stone. The sun burned through the thin fabric of her robe, revealing the outline of her frail form. The spectators gasped, mistaking exhaustion for ecstasy. Melantha raised her hands toward the heavens, reciting the words taught to her, a prayer of surrender and devotion. But halfway through, her voice faltered. The air thickened. The ground beneath her feet pulsed. The priests rushed forward, urging her to continue, their faces bright with both reverence and fear. To them, her trembling was the god's possession, proof that Apollo still spoke through her. Yet within her mind, another presence coiled tighter, whispering in a language no hymn could silence. The whisper said that victory was a lie, that the serpent's blood had merely seeped into the stone, waiting to rise again. When the ritual ended, the people cheered. Wine spilled, songs rose, and the temple bells rang in triumph. But in the shadow of the marble, Melantha stood motionless. She could still feel the pulse beneath the floor, the heartbeat of something ancient, something that refused to die. The feast had celebrated a god's conquest. Yet what stirred beneath Delphi that day was not submission, but memory, the slow awakening of a truth buried deeper than any altar. By the third year of her service, Melantha's voice had become both feared and revered. Pilgrims claimed her prophecies shook the soul. The priests whispered that the god's fire now burned true brightly within her. Each trance left her weaker, yet her words grew darker. She no longer spoke of triumph or light, but of rot, silence, and the devouring earth. The vapors she inhaled each month had deepened in strength. The fisher's breath was changing, sharper, heavier, almost metallic. When she descended into the adyton, the fumes curled around her like living smoke. At first, she felt only dizziness. But soon, visions came without prayer, without music, visions that clawed through her mind unbidden. She spoke of temples sinking into the soil, of rivers running black, of a god who fed on the voices of women until none remained. The attendants trembled as they wrote her words, afraid to repeat them. The high priest dismissed these utterances as corruption, the madness of the vessel, he called it. Yet her predictions began to echo real misfortunes, earthquakes in the valley, blighted crops, the death of a noble's son. Melantha's trances grew longer, her body frailer. Her hair turned ashen, her skin pale as limestone. Between trances, she wandered the temple's corridors whispering to herself, her fingers brushing the stone as though she felt something pulsing inside it. Witnesses said she could sense the fissure even from above ground, that she moved toward it like a moth toward heat. Records from the Hellenic scholars centuries later describe oracles whose prophecies turned against the sanctuaries that kept them, women silenced for speaking what priests refused to hear. In one fragment, a chronicler writes of a maiden who spoke of the god's hunger and was buried beneath the mountain for her blasphemy. Many now believe this was Melantha. During her final months, the boundaries between vision and reality dissolved. When she looked upon the priests, she no longer saw men, only hollow shapes filled with smoke. The god's voice, once distant and golden, had become a whisper of soil and breath, murmuring from beneath the stone. "He is not the sun," the voice told her. "He is the shadow cast by light." She tried to resist the trances, to stay conscious, but the mountain's breath claimed her again and again. Each time she awoke, she found strange symbols drawn in ash beside her mat, curling, serpentine shapes that no one admitted to making. The attendants avoided her gaze. Even the high priest grew cautious, insisting that her rituals be performed privately. The sanctuary began to fear its own oracle. Some said the god had abandoned her. Others whispered that she had become the mouthpiece of what Apollo had slain, the serpent beneath the marble, rising once more through her lungs. Melantha's final prophecies were never officially recorded. Fragments suggest she spoke of the end of gods, of stone crumbling into dust, of a voice returning to the womb of the earth. The priests called it pollution. The people called it blasphemy. But to Melantha, it was release, the truth whispered through smoke by something far older than any god. And as her voice broke under the weight of her final vision, the mountain trembled as if the earth itself mourned what it had revealed. The winter that followed Melantha's final prophecy arrived like a curse. The snow refused to fall, yet the air was bitter and dry. Crops withered on the slopes below Delphi, and pilgrims began to whisper that the god had grown silent. The priests blamed the people, claiming their sins had polluted the sanctuary, but within the marble walls, fear festered. The fisher's breath, once pale and fragrant, had begun to change. When the attendants descended to the adyton, they found the vapors darker, heavier, almost suffocating. The laurel leaves burned to black ash, and a foul scent rose from the pit. Not sulfur or incense, but decay. The priests ordered more sacrifices, hoping to purify the air. Lambs, doves, and even young bulls were offered, their blood poured into the fissure. Yet the smoke that rose remained black. Melantha, though weakened and half-mad, felt the change more keenly than any of them. The breath that once filled her with visions now tore at her lungs. Each inhalation burned. Each trance left her closer to collapse. The attendants begged the high priest to release her from service, but he refused. "A vessel does not retire," he said. "The god decides when she is empty." Historical writings describe this as the period of Delphi's decline, when earthquakes began to shake the temple and the oracle's voice grew erratic. The faithful called it divine punishment. But later scholars would suspect the truth. The earth itself was shifting beneath the sanctuary, the fissure growing unstable, releasing gases thick with poison. What the ancients called the god's silence was perhaps the earth reclaiming what it had lent. One night, a tremor struck the mountain. Statues toppled, torches fell, and a crack split the marble floor near the adyton's entrance. The priests gathered in panic, demanding that Melantha enter the chamber to appease the god. She was carried down, feverish and trembling, her breath shallow. The attendants tried to steady her, but she brushed them aside. "He is not above," she whispered. "He waits below." The fissure exhaled violently, belching smoke the color of iron. The torches dimmed, their flames bending toward the pit as though drawn by hunger. Melantha stepped forward, barefoot, her eyes wide but unfocused. Her voice, when it came, was not her own. It was low and echoing, like stone grinding beneath the earth. The priests fell to their knees, thinking the god had returned, but her words chilled them. She spoke not of light, but of darkness, not of purity, but of debt. She said the earth had given them breath, and now it came to reclaim it. The god you serve, she murmured, was born from what he conquered. You feed him with smoke, but the smoke remembers. When the vision ended, Melantha collapsed beside the pit. The attendants rushed to her, but her pulse was faint, her skin cold. From the fissure, the black vapor continued to rise, curling through her hair like a veil. By dawn, the temple's upper walls had cracked. The marble floor bore a dark stain that no one could clean. The priests sealed the adyton for the first time in centuries, declaring the god's voice withdrawn. Yet beneath the silence, the mountain still breathed, slow, steady, and foul. And within that breath, they swore they could still hear her, whispering softly through the smoke that turned black. When the fissure darkened beyond repair, the priests declared that Apollo demanded one final act of purification. The people of Delphi gathered at the base of the sanctuary, frightened yet obedient, for the oracle's silence had become an omen. Without her voice, they feared the mountain would turn against them. The high priest announced that the god required renewal, a cleansing sacrifice to restore the light. Melantha was brought forth at dawn, pale as ash, her breath shallow, her eyes distant. Her body bore the marks of years spent in devotion, scars from the laurel branches, burns from incense, bruises from the marble floor where she had knelt too long. Yet to the crowd, she was still sacred. They cheered when she appeared, believing she would save them once more. The adyton was opened for the last time. Smoke billowed from the pit, darker than night, heavy with the stench of oil and decay. The attendants hesitated, but the high priest raised his hand and commanded them to proceed. The god must speak, he said, and the vessel must open. They anointed Melantha with olive oil and laurel, covering her trembling body in sacred symbols. A wreath of withered leaves was placed upon her head, a mockery of divinity. She was led to the edge of the fissure, where the heat distorted the air, and made to kneel. The priests began to chant. Their voices rose and fell in solemn rhythm, drowning out the muffled sobs of the attendants. Historical fragments later unearthed describe this day as an act of reconsecration, though none could explain why the oracle never returned. Some believed she perished in ecstasy, consumed by the god's presence. Others whispered of deliberate silence, of priests who sealed the chamber to bury their own crimes. As the chanting deepened, Melantha's body convulsed. The smoke coiled around her like a serpent, thick and slow. She tried to rise, but her strength was gone. The fumes filled her lungs, turning her breath into a wet rattle. Still, the priests did not stop. They shouted prayers over her gasps, their faces radiant with zeal. To them, her suffocation was revelation, the god reclaiming his voice. She fell forward onto the stone, her hands clawing at the marble. The smoke grew denser, swallowing her form until she was only a shadow within the vapors. Witnesses claimed the fissure roared, a deep, guttural sound that shook the chamber walls. Then came silence. The chanting ceased. The high priest stepped forward, gazing into the darkness where she had fallen. When the smoke cleared hours later, the pit had cooled. No trace of Melantha remained. The priests declared it a miracle, that the god had taken her into himself, her mortal voice forever joined with the divine. The people of Delphi wept in reverence, never knowing that beneath their feet lay not holiness, but a tomb. Centuries later, when the ruins of Delphi were uncovered, archaeologists found a chamber sealed with stone, its walls scorched black. At its center, they discovered fragments of a laurel wreath fused into marble, and beside it, the faint imprint of a human hand reaching upward through soot. The oracle had not ascended. She had drowned in the breath of the mountain, consumed by the very god she served. Centuries had passed since Melantha's disappearance, and Delphi had long since risen and fallen under the weight of empires. Marble columns lay broken, gold and bronze were stripped from the altars, and the sanctuary echoed only with wind. Yet beneath the ruins, the fissure still breathed. Its exhalations were faint now, but persistent, the lingering voice of something older than Apollo, older than any god inscribed in stone. Archaeologists in later ages uncovered shards of female figurines, fragments of serpentine carvings, and traces of ash lining the pit. Analysis revealed gases once released through the fissure, carbon dioxide and ethylene, enough to induce trances in those who inhaled them. Scholars realized that what the ancients called divine inspiration had always been bound to the mountain itself, and that the voices of the oracles had been drawn from the earth, not merely from gods. Melantha's story, preserved in fragments of Hellenic texts and whispered legends, became the emblem of a lost lineage. She had been the last to serve not Apollo, but Gaia, the earth goddess whose voice was replaced with the sun god's command. Her trances had been called holy, but they had been the final echoes of an erased matriarchy, a testament to how devotion could be twisted into coercion. The fissure beneath Delphi is now sealed, yet the mountain remembers. The ancient rocks retain their history in fissures, mineral stains, and lingering vapors. The sanctuary above celebrates triumphs of marble and gold, while the earth below whispers of loss, control, and survival. The Pythia's voice, once feared, revered, and ultimately silenced, belonged first to Gaia. Each inhalation of smoke, each trembling word, was a conversation with the goddess herself, spoken through a body commandeered by men who sought dominion. In examining Delphi's layers, scholars found that every act of devotion demanded sacrifice beyond the altar. The young women who served there, Melantha among them, surrendered autonomy, privacy, and body in ways codified as holiness. The sacred and the coercive were indistinguishable. The oracle's death was not a singular horror, but the culmination of centuries of erasure, a ritualized extinguishing of feminine authority that had once flowed freely in the fissures of the mountain. Visitors to the ruins may see only the shining columns, the theater of marble steps, and the sanctity of legend. But beneath, Gaia's presence lingers in every crack, every echo, and every dark seam of stone. She remains silent, but not absent. Melantha's body may have perished, but her consciousness, entwined with the breath of the earth, left a trace, a warning of what occurs when power bends devotion into violence, and when the divine becomes a mask for human cruelty. The silence that fell over Gaia's sanctuary was not emptiness. It was memory. It was mourning. It was the echo of voices stolen, prophecies twisted, and bodies commanded to endure more than their strength could bear. And within that silence lies the truth that historians, poets, and pilgrims alike had long ignored. That Delphi's brilliance was built upon shadow. That every oracle's gift demanded the surrender of something far older and more elemental than a god, the voice of Gaia herself. Even now, when wind stirs through the mountain's fissures, one can imagine a faint exhalation, the breath of the earth, remembering Melantha, remembering every Pythia, remembering the silence into which the goddess's voice had been forced.